Hi, I want to welcome you to the third segment of this lecture on the global economic crisis and its implications for Canada. Uh, in this third segment, what I'm going to be talking about is the wider implications for the global economy of the economic crisis, the crash of 2008. I'm basing this on my new book, Beyond the Bubble, Imagining a New Canadian Economy, that was published in the fall of 2009 by Between the Lines Publishers in Toronto. All right, let's look at the wider implications of the crash. In segment two, we talked about the crash itself. The wider meaning, in my view, of this economic crash and crisis in the world is the changing role of the United States in the global economy. In a broad sense, what we can say is that the United States, which has at present in recent years has accounted for about 20% of the output of the world in terms of goods and services, in other words, American GDP. Incidentally, we can compare that to 1945 when the U.S. at the end of World War II accounted for 50% of global GDP. What I'm saying is that the U.S. is in transition to playing a smaller role. Let's say it's going down to about 15% of global GDP, while countries, especially those in Asia, the giants like China and India, are going to account for a bigger part of global GDP. In other words, what's happening is that the American-centered global economy and the system of what we have described as globalization over the last couple of decades is coming to an end. And this is the crisis of that system which is going on. Now, some of the things, we talked about the bubble-prone economy in the last segment, some of the things that have driven the American economy toward the crisis in which it finds itself has been the attempt by a wealthy elite at the top of American society to profit enormously from developments in the American economy and developments in the global economy. What we've seen, and this is one of the reasons why the collapse has taken place, is the rise of finance and the financial sector in the United States. Over the last couple of decades, to the eve of the crash in 2000, to the eve of the crash, we can say 2007, the year before the crash, the financial sector in the United States accounted for 21% of American GDP. That's extraordinary. And that compared to only 12% of American GDP being accounted for through manufacturing. Here you've got the manufacturing sector in the world's most powerful country. Only 12% of its GDP is accounted for through manufacturing, and you've got finance, which has swollen to 21%. Now, that may be okay for the Cayman Islands. It's not okay for the world's most powerful country with a population of 300 million people. Because you've got to remember this. Finance, the financial sector, is there supposedly to make other things possible. It's a means to an end. Finance in itself is neither a service nor a good that improves people's health, entertains them, allows them to travel, or provides them with goods that they want and need. It's supposed to make those things, open the door to making those things possible. What's happened is that the financial sector and the large corporations in the financial sector and the investors in the financial sector have created a whole series of instruments to increase their risk so that they can increase their rate of return. This is exactly the kind of thing that was happening on the eve of the Great Depression in the late 1920s. Then it was a simple thing. It was people buying on what was called margin. What they did is they put up a small proportion of the capital so that they could buy a vast amount of stock. And then, of course, if that stock went down, there were margin calls by banks that said, all right, now you got to pay up. And that became notorious. When the crash occurred, of course, in 1929, all kinds of people got caught on margin calls. People jumped off buildings. And in the years to follow, the United States government and other governments legislated to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. In other words, people speculating far beyond their means. But in the past 10 or 15 years, especially in recent years, there has been the rise and the creation of a whole series of new financial instruments that have been used to allow investors once again to return to play this kind of game. And some of those instruments that we now talk about derivatives, which allows people to bet on where stocks or particular markets or the orange crop in Florida are going to be at some point in the future. We have things called shorts, where people can in fact buy a short, predict that a stock that they're actually betting on is going to go down at some point in the future to provide them with a kind of, if you like, insurance against that. One of the wackiest of these new creations is called credit default swaps. And the way it works is this: a company that wants to increase its risk and its ability to go out and put out more credit in the world goes to another company and says, "Hey, we're gonna take out some insurance in case this set of ventures we're engaged in doesn't go anywhere." The other company, that's why it's called a swap, sells them a kind of insurance. And these credit default swaps, which allowed financial companies to engage in much bigger and riskier investments on the basis of the capital they had, these credit default swaps have been estimated to exist, and I'm not using this word wrongly, in the trillions of dollars. So that when the crash took place, they turned out, of course, to be worthless. It turned out that the people who sold the so-called insurance were not in any kind of position to pick up the tab for the huge disaster that occurred in the fall of 2008. And so this instrument allowed people to take higher risks in exactly the same way as they did in the late 1920s with margin. And we saw, of course, this immense crash, which has dragged down so much of the financial sector and forced governments to bail out financial institutions in the United States and around the world. Another instrument was called securitization. What this did was you have investors who you have corporations that take what are in effect, what we learned were toxic mortgages and other kinds of investments, and they chop them up. They dice them and they spice them and they chop them up and then repackage them as financial instruments to be sold to investors and to other companies. Securitization. And what that did was simply to spread ultimately the toxicity that helped drag down the American economy. So we've had this rise of the financial sector. That's important because it's unsustainable at that level. The United States in the future, no matter how much the Obama administration or American finance tries to put itself back in the position where it was before the crash, this is simply not sustainable. We're going to see a transition in the American economy in which finance has to play a smaller role than it played in 2007 and up to the eve of the crash in 2008. Now, also underlying the crash that occurred in 2008 and fundamental to the future of the system is the interconnected layers of indebtedness that exist in the United States. These are fundamental to the crisis and guarantee that the crisis is going to continue for years to come, perhaps for as long as a decade, because of the seriousness of this indebtedness in the United States. The first layer of the indebtedness is the U.S. national debt. That's the debt of the United States federal government, which when the crash occurred in 2008 stood at $11 trillion.